PowerPlayChess, brought to you in association with Kagi. I'm resuming my reports on the Sinquefield Cup and we're on to round 6. I hope you enjoyed your free day. So as you can see, I'm back home in my office with my usual vibrancy around me. A mess. Never mind, let's crack on. So I'm going to show you 2 games. So first of all, we've got Nepomniachtchi against Fabiano Caruana. And then I'm going to show you the end of an extraordinary game between Gukesh and Vachier-Lagrave. So anyway, let's crack on. Nepo against Caruana. And Fabi goes for a Sicilian and some kind of dragon variation. So he's obviously wanting to go for it in this game. But he's played this early fianchetto, which gives white the option to go for c4 and a Marozzi bind. But interestingly, Nepo declines to go in for that. So we have a slightly more traditional dragon variation, but the move order is interesting because black hasn't yet played d6, which opens up interesting possibilities, as I'll show you in a second. So bishop c4, castles. Notice black hasn't played d6 yet, which means if white is going for the standard Yugoslav attack, so for example with f3 and you want to play queen d2 and castles queenside, f3 is incorrect in this position because of queen b6. That's a very nice trick. Because if bishop b3, then this knight takes e4. A very typical dragon trick with an attack on d4. More about that in a second. So that's why white has to just hesitate for a move and play bishop b3. Oh, by the way, again, another typical dragon trick is after queen d2, knight g4. Hitting that bishop is very strong. So that's why bishop b3 has to be played first. Then d6, knight g4 is a threat again, so therefore f3. And now we're back into the typical Yugoslav attack, except that white has already put the bishop round on b3, which introduces interesting possibilities for black. Queen a5. Now, the normal move here is queen d2, notice a castle queenside. But it's been shown that, in fact, black is doing okay in this position after exchanging and playing bishop e6 and then a quick b5. This has a reasonable reputation for black, which might explain Nepo's next move, which is very unusual. Nepo very quickly, that's his style, played queen d3. I mean, this looks odd because it allows black to gain a tempo with knight e5. But it does avoid that variation with knight takes. So if, for example, black attempts this idea with bishop e6, then castles queenside and b5 simply isn't possible because that'll just be taken. So I think that's the idea behind queen d3. As I said, very unusual move. Only been played on a few occasions. The problem is that with knight e5, black gains a tempo. And this is a very standard position. I mean, it's been seen in hundreds and hundreds of games, except with white to move. Because of queen d3 and then knight e5, queen d2, white has lost a tempo. But clearly Nepo believes, or his computer believes, that this is still worth playing for white. I grew up in London in the early 1970s. That's when I was playing my first chess. And at that time in junior tournaments, you could guarantee one thing, that you would always see the dragon, the Sicilian dragon played. This was the English variation at the time. You know, you had players such as Jonathan Mestel and Tony Miles, who used it with great success in the 1970s. And after that, you know, many aspiring players who later became grandmasters, such as William Watson, Julian Hodgson, they played it with success. I mean, we all played it. You know, I played it too. It was just in the air. You know, you had to at that time. But I became attracted to other kinds of Sicilians, usually with a backward d-pawn. But I had plenty of practice attempting to duff up the dragon on the white side. And let me tell you, you have to have your wits about you. It is so tricky. But yeah, it amazes me that we're seeing this position, which is so familiar to me, and yet black has an extra tempo. But Nepo was bashing out his moves. In fact, it was Caruana who was sort of thinking things through. What have I got myself into here? But Caruana played in the standard way with knight c4, and that should be exchanged off. And then g4. So Nepo isn't going for the traditional h4, h5 attack, not yet. He's playing it in a slightly different way with just this advance of g4, which of course is also a traditional way of playing. And I don't see what's wrong with rook c8 here. We're already with some pressure on the queen side. But Caruana played bishop e6 after 21 minutes thought. And Nepo he bashed out his next move. He played knight b3, and I really don't like that move. And I think that white is okay here, actually. For example, knight e2. I think you have to somehow appreciate the danger of that queen and, you know, try and drive it away. So, for example, if the queen dropped back here, you could exchange, push the rook back, and then go for h4. I mean, this looks quite attractive with, yeah, slightly damaged pawns on the king side. Or this endgame, I think it's playable for both sides, but I think white is pretty comfortable. And, you know, you can even play some kind of Marozzi here with c4, bringing the knight back to c3 to stop b5. I mean, this looks quite pleasant. And, you know, perhaps you can get in g5 at some moment and knight d5 potentially. So I think this is still quite playable for white. That looks like the most reliable move, knight e2. But Nepo played knight b3, hitting the queen, which dropped back to a6. The knight is rather sidelined on b3. In so many variations of the dragon, of the Sicilian rather, as a whole, the knight can end up on b3, and very often it's not very well placed there. Bishop d4 played. Rook c8, well, the standard pressure on the c file. And Nepo has to avoid what comes next. You can do that in various ways. I mean, my computer suggests queen g5 here, with potentially the idea of swinging across to force an exchange of queens. I mean, it looks a bit artificial, but it would be better than what happened in the game. g5 played, according to this, after 6 seconds by Nepo. And Caruana takes on e4. There is nothing original about this at all. I have seen this in hundreds of games. So let's just work it through. It can be captured in both by both knight and pawn. So if knight takes, then rook takes. So black has won a pawn basically, and an important bishop. And if knight takes, well, of course that leads to instant mate in the corner. So Nepo took on e4 with the pawn, and bishop takes, knight takes, and rook takes c3. The classic dragon rook takes c3 sacrifice. I mean, it's not even a sacrifice, because of course if pawn takes, then once again we have mate in the corner. White could try knight takes bishop, but then, I mean, you exchange on c2. So you're grabbing the queen. And for example, like this, how many pawns does black have? Queen and 2 pawns against 2 rooks. But so many targets here, the king as well as the target. I mean, black has a completely winning position. You know, if I'd seen this position in one of those junior tournaments I mentioned in London in the early 70s, I would have just shrugged my shoulders and thought, well, there you go, another mug falls for one of those dragon cheap tricks, basically. I've seen it 1,000 times. But at this level, I have never seen anything quite like it. Such a simple trick. Actually, okay, that's just jogged a memory. Anand against Kasparov in their World Championship match in 1995 also involved a very cheap trick, but not exactly like this. That was another cheap trick. The dragon has that effect on people, apparently. It's so simple. It really is. And Nepo couldn't believe it. He was shaking his head. Just moving so quickly again. So, anyway, back to the game. This threatened. So, A3, Queen C4, threatening this again. So, B3 and the Queen came back. So, with that little sequence of moves, basically Caruana has established this rook on the fantastic square C3. It's not going to be have to move away. And Caruana is a clear pawn up, a beautiful pawn up with continuing pressure on the C-file. That's an isolated pawn. There are weaknesses here. I mean, this amounts to a winning position for black. I mean, I think Nepo wanted to just have the thing over and done with. He could defend this pawn, but he just played rook c1. I mean, it's a terrible move. Queen takes e3. Complete collapse. h4. The rook comes up. Ready to switch to a5. Rook f1 played, and then a simple final move. Bishop takes b3, which completely destroys white's defences. So here Nepo resigned. I mean, let's just go through what could potentially take place. I mean, I wouldn't really count this as a sacrifice. I mean, it's kind of so obvious. Let's just basically black can do it all with checks. So all black needs to do is make sure that that rook is coming into the game. And it does so here. And finally, you win the queen. I mean, white can play in various ways, but, you know, black always manages to win the queen or checkmate. So, yeah, in this kind of position, now it's queen and 4 against the king, completely winning position. So that's why Nepo resigned after bishop takes b3. An absolute shocker for Nepo and a gift for Fabiano Caruana. Now, I want to show you another game. The ending of Gukesh against Vacher-le-Grave. So this was a really complex game. A Najdorf, lots of cut and thrust. Gukesh won a pawn, but it was very unclear. But round about this point, which is move 39, with the players running quite short of time by this stage, then it looks like Gukesh is in control. He's a pawn up. Vacher-le-Grave has made an incursion with the rook, but basically white has everything covered. Gukesh is about to run this pawn down the board. So Vacher-le-Grave desperately needs counterplay here. So he started with g5. This is a fascinating endgame. So the a-pawn starts on its journey. And remember, when it gets there, it'll be check. That's significant. h5. a5, g4. It's like a chicken race. Who's going to blink first? h takes g4. I will be returning to a position here later on. But let's just see how the game went, because it is just fascinating. So f3. An exchange. Now the knight has to move. Rook h2, threatening mate. So Vacher-le-Grave is getting somewhere. King g1. Bishop g3. Okay, covering the rook and ready to push. A7, but the pawn is just one step from queening. F2, king F1. I mean, this is pretty much forced for both sides. A check. And rook takes C1. Okay, winning the rook. Threatening to get a queen, but now it's Gukesh to play. And he gets a queen with check. King steps up. Queen B7 check. So this is really scary. Somehow Gukesh needs to do something about this advance. Now, if the king steps back, then white is going to win. For example, like this. And the rook is loose. You're going to win with a double attack like this. So after queen b7 check, Vacher le Grave stepped up with the king. Another check. King g5. And incredibly, the checks have run out. The sensible checks. What can the queen do? And suddenly this is a threat. If king takes bishop, now remember this position, this is simply winning for black. No checks to black's king, and the king is going to be checked to bits by the queen and the rook. That's winning for black. So Gukesh played queen c4, covering this square, and now a check. This is all forced, basically. So now Vacher le Grave is the exchange up, and this rook is about to win these pawns. So Gukesh is in massive danger. Massive trouble in this position. But there is still a way to draw. So I'm going to have a drink. You have a think. How would you play with white in this position to secure the draw? And I tell you, this was really impressive because Gukesh found this in double quick time. He had to. He's running short of time. Cheers, folks. White to play and draw. Very tricky. So let's say knight d5. This was not played. Rook takes. This is winning very easily for black. Typical position. A pin. The king is forced back. King f4. The king steps in and takes the pawn. Or, let's say king e3. You take here, king here. Again, king steps in. Nothing to do. There's going to be a nasty check, and this pawn is going to drop. But there is a way to draw. So clever. Knight d1. Protects the pawn. So rook d2 forces the knight out of the way. Rook takes b2. And now, this is where the knight needs to be. d3. Brilliant defense. Attacks the rook, of course. Attacks the pawn. But also covers that entry square on f4. That's crucial. So, okay, the rook steps back to defend the pawn. And now white has a fortress. There's nothing for black to do in this position. I mean, the king can try and step around, but white can just wait. And the game ended like this. Well, I mean, let me just show you what can happen if black tries to step around. Actually, nothing happens. You could even play here. There's nothing to do. The king can't break through because these squares are covered. And the rook, well, it can't do anything because it needs to guard the e-pawn. So, you know, like this. Nothing happening. So in the game, Vacher le Grave played rook a5. And yeah, you can see that square is covered, so king f4 isn't possible. So Vacher le Grave simply forced to draw like this. That's a draw. And that was the end of the game. Now, I'd like to take you back to the middle of that race because there's an absolutely fascinating moment. Okay, so Vacher Graf has just played pawn to g4, and this is where Gukesh exchanged pawns. All seems reasonable, but instead of exchanging, Gukesh could have played a6 immediately, and this makes a small but massive difference to the outcome. White should be winning after this. Okay, why? Well, let's find out. So, okay, let's see if black plays in exactly the same way. F3. An exchange. So we had this before. The knight has to move. And rook h2. Everything as before. The only difference is that these h-pawns remain on the board, which doesn't seem significant at the moment, but watch. So king g1, bishop g3. Pawn advances, and as before, the f-pawn comes forward, a check, black wins the rook, and now we have this situation where white queens, the king steps up, check, here queen takes, king g5, and again it looks as though the king is safe, and then white has to deal with this issue. So this is exactly the same as we had before. Again, I'm going to repeat it, but with the inclusion of these pawns. So these pawns remain on the board. And here white is winning. In this case, you can take the bishop, because when black queens, there's an h-pawn here that you advance one step, and that is checkmate. That's the difference. Incredible. Of course, when you're short of time, impossible to calculate a variation like that. So yes, in the game we had this position. I'll just come back to it. This position, if I can find it, without the h-pawns, but with the h-pawns, this is actually winning for white because of that h-pawn, h4 check. Beautiful stuff. Impossible to calculate when you're short of time, but yeah, incredible. Okay, so in the other games, well, they were drawn. Crucial game was Wesley So against Alireza Firouzja. Wesley, he can be such a frustrating player. He had white against Firouzja, who's leading the tournament, but Wesley didn't really go for it. Played something quite mild, and Alireza equalised easily, and the game burned out to a draw. So that means that Firouzja is still leading the tournament. Right, well, look out for my round 7 report, which will follow, well, after round 7 probably. And thanks for watching.